Welcome back to True Freedom, where we dive deep into the timeless ideas that challenge conventional thinking and inspire personal growth. Today, we're exploring one of Friedrich Nietzsche's most provocative works, Twilight of the Idols, written in 1888. This book is a lightning tour of Nietzsche's philosophy, offering sharp critiques of morality, religion, and reason while championing life-affirming values. If you've ever questioned the foundations of societal norms or sought clarity on how to live authentically, this video will resonate deeply with you. Join us as we unpack Nietzsche's radical ideas and discover why they remain profoundly relevant today. Maxims and Darrows, Nietzsche's philosophy in a nutshell. Nietzsche opens Twilight of the Idols with a collection of aphorisms titled Maxims, and arose these concise statements encapsulate his core beliefs and serve as an intellectual warm-up for readers. Among these are some of his most celebrated quotes, such as "What does not kill me makes me stronger, and without music, life would be a mistake." Each maxim carries profound implications about resilience, purpose, and the human condition. For instance, the idea that possessing a clear why enables us to endure anyhow reflects a Stoic-like emphasis on inner resolve, a theme that resonates throughout the text. These maxims also introduce Nietzsche's critique of false idols, ideas or systems of thought that people blindly worship despite their emptiness. The problem of Socrates, rejecting the dialectic method. In The Problem of Socrates, Nietzsche launches a scathing critique of ancient philosophers who viewed life as inherently worthless. He singles out Socrates for particular disdain, arguing that the dialectic method, an approach rooted in logic and debate, is fundamentally flawed. According to Nietzsche, this method represents a form of rebellion against instinctual wisdom, born out of resentment toward natural impulses. While Socrates equated reason with virtue and happiness, Nietzsche counters that true fulfillment comes from embracing instinct rather than suppressing it. His perspective aligns loosely with Stoicism's focus on aligning oneself with nature, but diverges sharply in its rejection of rationalism. Nietzsche introduces the concept of decadence to describe systems of thought that prioritize abstract reasoning over lived experience, leading to spiritual and cultural decline. Reason in Philosophy, the Falsification of Reality. In the essay Reason in Philosophy, Nietzsche challenges the notion of reason as a reliable guide to truth. He argues that philosophers have historically falsified sensory evidence in favor of metaphysical constructs, creating a dichotomy between the real world and the apparent world. By privileging an unchanging, non-sensory realm over the dynamic, sensory-rich world of everyday life, traditional philosophy fosters a hatred of nature itself. This critique mirrors Stoicism's emphasis on accepting reality as it is, though Nietzsche takes it further by rejecting even the Stoic ideal of cosmic order. Instead, he advocates for a philosophy that celebrates flux and becoming, echoing Heraclitus's doctrine of eternal change. For Nietzsche, clinging to static ideals stifles creativity and vitality, perpetuating a culture of decline. The real world is a myth, history of an error. One of the most intriguing sections of Twilight of the Idols is how the real world at last became a myth. Here, Nietzsche traces the evolution of the Platonic Christian worldview through 6 stages, which he calls the history of an era. Initially, Plato posited a transcendent real world accessible only through wisdom. Christianity adapted this idea, making it attainable after death. Kant relegated it to the unknowable, and positivism ultimately dismissed it altogether. In the final 2 stages, Nietzsche revalues this entire framework, declaring the real world a useless fiction. This process culminates in his call for a revaluation of all values symbolized by Zarathustra, the archetypal Mensch. By dismantling these myths, Nietzsche invites readers to embrace the richness of the present moment, free from the constraints of illusory ideals. Morality is anti-nature, affirming life over asceticism. Nietzsche's critique of morality reaches its peak in Morality as Anti-Nature, where he condemns anti-natural ethics as hostile to life itself. Unlike Stoics, who advocate moderation and self-discipline, Nietzsche rejects ascetic practices that seek to suppress natural instincts entirely. He argues that Christianity, with its emphasis on self-denial and guilt, exemplifies this decadent morality. Similarly, Schopenhauer's philosophy of renouncing the will to live embodies what Nietzsche sees as the ultimate expression of weakness. However, Nietzsche does not advocate hedonism either. Instead, he proposes the spiritualization of passions, transforming them into sources of strength and creativity. This nuanced stance underscores his belief in affirming life without succumbing to excess or denial. The Four Great Errors. Deconstructing Causality. In the Four Great Errors Nietzsche identifies for fundamental mistakes underlying all religious and moral doctrines. These include confusing cause and effect, attributing false causes to phenomena, inventing imaginary causes, and believing in free will. He vehemently denies the existence of human accountability, dismissing it as a tool used by religious authorities to exert control. Free will, according to Nietzsche, is a psychological illusion designed to justify punishment and guilt. Instead, he argues that unconscious drives and emotions shape behavior far more than conscious decisions. This deconstruction of causality lays the groundwork for his broader project of re-evaluating traditional values, urging readers to question deeply ingrained assumptions about morality and responsibility. The improvers of mankind know moral facts. Nietzsche provocatively declares that there are no moral facts in the improvers of mankind throughout history. Individuals claiming to improve humanity have often done so at the expense of freedom and authenticity. Religion, for example, has corrupted human beings under the guise of moral improvement. Similarly, the caste system in India sought to elevate certain groups while dehumanizing others, particularly the untouchables. Nietzsche sees these efforts as attempts to impose artificial hierarchies but stifle individual potential. His critique extends to modern institutions, including education, which he believes fails to cultivate critical thinking and creativity. True improvement, he suggests, lies in fostering independence and resilience rather than conformity. What the Germans lack: culture versus politics. What the Germans lack. Nietzsche laments the decline of intellectual sophistication in German society, attributing it to the prioritizations of politics over culture. He argues that genuine cultural flourishing occurs during periods of political decline, when individuals focus on artistic and philosophical pursuits rather than power struggles. Education plays a crucial role in reversing this trend. Yet Nietzsche criticizes contemporary educational practices for failing to teach essential skills like observation, reflection, and eloquence. Drawing parallels to Stoicism's emphasis on self-mastery, he insists that true learning requires discipline and dedication. Only those willing to embrace hardship and strive for excellence can contribute meaningfully to culture. Expeditions of an Untimely Man. Cultural critique. Along this chapter, Expeditions of an Untimely Man showcases Nietzsche's incisive commentary on various cultural figures and movements. He critiques the superficial desire for generous feelings prevalent among intellectuals of his time, contrasting it with the Dionysian spirit of intoxication and vitality. Notably, he praises Dostoevsky as a psychologist who offered valuable insights into human nature, alongside Napoleon and Goethe as exemplars of the Mensch. Nietzsche's ambition to distill complex ideas into concise aphorisms reflects his commitment to clarity and precision. His closing remark that creators must be hard, both mentally and emotionally, underscores the importance of resilience in achieving greatness. To summarize, Twilight of the Idols is Nietzsche's bold manifesto against false idols and outdated values. Through incisive critiques of morality, religion, and reason, he advocates for a life-affirming philosophy centered on instinct, creativity, and resilience. As Nietzsche concludes, "Become hard," a call to embrace challenges and forge one's own path. Now, it's your turn to engage. What do you think about Nietzsche's ideas? Do you agree that traditional morality stifles individual potential? Share your thoughts in the comments below and join the discussion. Don't forget to subscribe to True Freedom for more explorations of trans philosophies like Stoicism and beyond. Until next time, stay curious and keep questioning.
Welcome to the deep dive. Today we're going to be cracking open Twilight of the Idols by Friedrich Nietzsche.
Oh, yeah.
You sent in a ton of articles and notes, so we'll be trying to pick out the most interesting parts and, make sure you get the most out of this philosophical powerhouse.
Yeah, it's a dense read for sure. But Nietzsche's critiques of morality and religion, and even reason itself, are surprisingly relevant, even though he was writing way back in the 1800s.
That's what I always find so fascinating about philosophy, right? These ideas can be centuries old, and yet they still hit us right where we live.
Right.
Okay, let's unpack this, starting with something Nietzsche calls maxims and arrows.
Okay, so think of those as philosophical darts, each one packed with a potent idea. You probably heard the most famous one. What does not kill me makes me stronger.
Oh, for sure.
It's become almost a cliche these days, but in the context of Twilight of the Idols, it goes beyond just physical resilience.
Right. It's easy to just slap that quote on a motivational poster. But what does it really mean when we think about it in terms of Nietzsche's work?
Well, it speaks to this idea of embracing challenges as opportunities for growth. Nietzsche believed that confronting difficulties, both internal and external, could actually forge a stronger, more resilient self.
So it's not about seeking out pain, but about using those inevitable tough moments to our advantage. I can definitely think of times where working through something difficult ultimately made me more capable.
Exactly. And throughout these maxims, Nietzsche keeps taking aim at what he calls false idols. These are essentially any ideas or systems of thought that we accept blindly without questioning them.
Okay, so that could be anything from societal norms to religious doctrines to even like certain philosophical schools of thought. Basically anything we take for granted without really examining it.
Precisely. Nietzsche was all about pushing us to examine our beliefs, to challenge the status quo, and to break free from anything that might be holding us back from reaching our full potential. And one of his biggest targets in this regard was, surprisingly, the philosopher Socrates.
Wait, Socrates, the father of Western philosophy. Didn't he champion reason and critical thinking? How could Nietzsche have a problem with that?
It seems counterintuitive, right? But Nietzsche felt that Socrates, through his emphasis on logic and the dialectic method, was actually suppressing a vital part of human experience, our instincts.
The dialectic method, just so we're all on the same page, is this process of debate and questioning that aims to arrive at truth through reasoned argument. So what you're saying is Nietzsche is saying that overemphasizing logic can actually disconnect us from our gut feelings, our intuition.
You got it, the case. Nietzsche believed that embracing those instincts, not just our rational mind, was crucial for a fully realized life. He saw this suppression of instinct as a symptom of what he called decadence, a kind of cultural decline where abstract thought overshadows lived experience.
It's like we're valuing our heads over our hearts in a way. And this ties back to those false idols because we might be clinging to logic as this ultimate authority, even when it's leading us away from what truly feels meaningful.
That's a great insight. Now, we've touched on Stoicism a bit, and it's interesting to compare Nietzsche's views to theirs. Both philosophies emphasize aligning oneself with nature, but their approaches to reason are quite different.
So the Stoics are all about using reason to understand and accept the natural order of things, whereas Nietzsche sees over-reliance on reason as a barrier to experiencing the fullness of life. Like they're both looking at nature, but through different lenses.
That's a great way to put it. For the Stoics, reason helps us find order and tranquility in a world that can seem chaotic. But for Nietzsche, clinging too tightly to reason actually prevents us from fully engaging with the world's vibrancy and constant change.
So it's not about rejecting reason altogether, but about recognizing its limits. It makes me wonder if in our modern world, we've maybe swung too far towards logic and analysis and lost touch with our intuition and that sense of awe in the face of the unknown.
That's a really interesting question, and it leads us to another key concept in Twilight of the Idols. Nietzsche's dismantling of the idea of a real world. He calls it the history of an error, this notion that there's some ultimate reality separate from our perception.
Wait, so he's saying the real world is a myth. That's a pretty bold claim. I'm definitely intrigued to hear how he backs that up.
He traces this concept all the way back to Plato's theory of forms, which posited this realm of perfect, unchanging ideas existing beyond our senses. Then it morphed into the Christian idea of heaven, a perfect afterlife separate from the flawed earthly realm. Nietzsche meticulously deconstructs this whole lineage of thought.
So he's saying that this idea of a true reality beyond our perception is actually a human construct, something we've invented rather than discovered?
Exactly. And because we've elevated this imaginary real world above our actual lived experience, we've devalued the present moment. We're always striving for something beyond something better instead of embracing the world as it is.
This is really making me rethink my own assumptions. So if there's no real world out there, what does that mean for how we should live?
This is where Nietzsche's call for a reevaluation of all values comes in. He's urging us to question every value we hold dear, to tear down the old framework, and create a new one based on embracing the present moment with all its messiness and beauty.
Wow, this is definitely a lot to unpack. It's like he's handing us a philosophical wrecking ball and saying, okay, go demolish those outdated ideas and build something new. But where do we even begin with that?
That's the challenge Nietzsche poses to us. He doesn't offer a blueprint for this new value system, but he gives us clues throughout Twilight of the Idols. And one of the most crucial starting points is his critique of traditional morality, which he sees as deeply problematic.
Okay, I'm really curious to hear where he goes with that. Morality seems like such a fundamental concept, the basis for how we live together as a society. How could he possibly critique that?
That's what makes Nietzsche so fascinating. He's willing to question even our most cherished beliefs. And he saw traditional morality, especially Christian morality, as anti-nature. He felt it was based on suppressing our natural instincts and desires, ultimately denying the very essence of life itself.
So it's like saying our natural impulses are inherently bad and we need to constantly fight against them. That does seem kind of suppressive, like we're always holding ourselves back.
That's precisely Nietzsche's point. He argues that this constant suppression leads to a kind of spiritual stagnation, a denial of our full potential. He contrasts this with the ancient Greeks, who he believed had a more healthy, life-affirming approach to their instincts.
So instead of seeing our instincts as something to be controlled, he's suggesting we should embrace them. That sounds a bit risky, doesn't it? Like, wouldn't that lead to chaos if everyone just followed their impulses?
That's a common concern. But Nietzsche wasn't advocating for reckless abandon. He believed in strength and self-mastery, but not the kind that comes from suppressing our nature. He talks about spiritualizing our passions, transforming them from raw impulses into sources of creativity and inspiration.
So it's more about harnessing that energy, channeling it into something productive and life-affirming, rather than just letting it run wild. I can see how that would be a more nuanced and ultimately more empowering approach.
Exactly. And this idea ties back to his concept of the Übermensch, which we'll explore later. But essentially, he's challenging us to redefine what it means to be moral, to move beyond the simplistic categories of good and evil, and find a way to live that affirms our full humanity.
This is definitely giving me a lot to think about. It's making me wonder if maybe our modern anxieties and neuroses stem at least in part from this idea, that we need to constantly be battling against our natural selves.
That's a really insightful observation, and it speaks to the enduring power of Nietzsche's work. Even though he was writing over a century ago, his ideas still have the ability to shake up our assumptions and make us see the world in a new light.
Okay. I think we've laid some serious groundwork here, exploring how Nietzsche challenges us to rethink our relationship with reason and reality and even our own instincts. But there's this one phrase you mentioned earlier that really stuck with me, Nietzsche's call to become hard. It sounds kind of intense, maybe even a little harsh.
It is a powerful image and definitely meant to be provocative. But to understand what he meant, we have to look at it through the lens of everything we've been discussing.
So if he's critiquing this traditional morality that suppresses our instincts, is becoming hard about toughening up against those natural urges, like becoming less emotional or something?
That's a common misconception. It's not about denying our emotions or becoming callous. Remember, Nietzsche saw traditional morality as a form of weakness. This shrinking away from life's challenges, becoming hard, is about cultivating an inner strength, a resilience that allows us to confront difficulty without being crushed by it.
So it's more like developing that inner fortitude, the ability to weather those storms that life inevitably throws at us, like not letting setbacks or criticisms completely derail us.
Exactly. Imagine a tree with deep roots. It can bend in the wind, but it won't break. Nietzsche is encouraging us to cultivate that kind of rootedness, both emotionally and intellectually, to have the courage to pursue our own path even when it's difficult or unpopular.
That image really helps. But how do we actually cultivate that kind of hardness? It can't be easy to just decide to be tougher.
It's definitely not a passive process. Nietzsche believed in self-discipline and pushing beyond our comfort zones. He also believed in constantly testing our limits, not shying away from discomfort.
So it's almost like we need to seek out challenges, embrace those moments that make us stretch and grow. I've definitely noticed that in my own life, the times I've really had to push myself are the times I've learned and evolved the most.
Absolutely. And that growth isn't limited to just physical challenges. Nietzsche also stresses the importance of intellectual honesty, even when it's uncomfortable. He's urging us to question everything, including our own cherished beliefs.
That makes sense. It can be really tough to confront those deeply held beliefs, the things we take for granted as truth. But if we're holding on to false idols, as he calls them, that's going to limit our potential right.
Exactly. Becoming hard also means being willing to face the truth, even when it's painful or contradicts what we want to believe. It's about having that intellectual courage to peel back the layers and see things as they really are.
I'm starting to see the appeal of this idea, but I can't help but wonder if there's a danger in taking it too far. Could focusing on this hardness lead to a lack of empathy or compassion for others?
That's a valid concern, and it's important to remember that Nietzsche's philosophy is complex, full of nuance that's easily missed. He wasn't advocating for a heartless dog-eat-dog world. He wanted us to move beyond conventional morality, but not to disregard the well-being of others.
So it's not about becoming an unfeeling robot, but about finding that balance between inner strength and recognizing the humanity of those around us.
Yet becoming hard is about developing the resources we need to navigate life with courage, integrity, and purpose, but not at the expense of our compassion.
This is definitely a concept I'll need to keep thinking about, especially in today's world where it feels like we're constantly being pulled in a million directions. It's almost like we need that hardness just to keep ourselves centered amidst all the chaos.
That's a great point. Nietzsche's ideas offer us a framework for navigating this complexity, for making sense of it all, and carving out our own path.
So it's not about conforming to some external ideology, but about developing that internal compass, that resilience that allows us to stay true to ourselves even when things get tough.
Exactly. And that brings us to one of Nietzsche's most intriguing and often misunderstood concepts, the idea of the Übermensch.
Ah, yes, the Superman, as it's often translated. I have to admit, this is one of the things about Nietzsche that I find both fascinating and a little intimidating.
It's definitely one of his most controversial ideas and often gets misinterpreted as advocating for some kind of elitism or even a master race.
Yeah, I've heard those interpretations too. And knowing how some of Nietzsche's work has been twisted and misused throughout history, it's easy to see how that could happen. But you're saying that's not what he truly meant.
Not at all. The Übermensch, rather than being a specific type of person or belonging to a certain social class, is more of an aspirational ideal. It represents human potential fully realized.
So it's not about being physically superior or dominating others, but about reaching a higher level of being almost a transcendence of our current limitations.
Precisely. The Übermensch embodies this idea of moving beyond conventional morality, embracing those instincts we were discussing, and creating their own values based on a deep understanding of life.
Okay, that paints a very different picture than the Superman image. But it also begs the question, is this even achievable? Can any of us actually become this Übermensch?
That's the question Nietzsche wants us to grapple with. He doesn't lay out a step-by-step guide, but he suggests that it involves a process of constant self-overcoming, of pushing past our perceived limitations, and embracing the challenges that come our way.
So it's not about reaching some final destination, but about the journey itself, the constant striving to become the best, most realized version of ourselves. That feels much more relatable and inspiring, honestly.
Exactly, and that journey is one that's open to all of us, regardless of our background or circumstances.
Sure.
It's about recognizing the potential for greatness that exists within each of us, even if it's hidden or dormant.
That's a really empowering message. It suggests that we're not just products of our environment or our genes, but that we have the ability to shape our own destinies to become something truly exceptional.
And that's a core theme in Nietzsche's work, this emphasis on individual agency, on taking responsibility for our own lives and creating meaning on our own terms.
I'm loving this conversation, but I have to admit, sometimes it feels like we're in this very heady philosophical realm. How do these ideas actually translate into everyday life? Like, how do we take this abstract concept of the Übermensch and make it relevant to our own experiences?
That's the million-dollar question, isn't it? And it's one that Nietzsche himself grapples with. He doesn't offer simple answers or prescriptive formulas. He's more interested in prompting us to think critically and find our own way.
So it's up to each of us to figure out how to integrate these ideas into our own unique context, our own lives and circumstances. It's about taking those philosophical sparks and using them to ignite our own personal journeys.
Exactly. And that's part of what makes Nietzsche's philosophy so compelling. It's not a rigid dogma or a set of rules to be followed blindly. It's a framework for thinking, a set of tools for navigating life's complexities and creating meaning on our own terms.
That makes so much sense. It's like he's handing us this incredibly powerful toolkit and saying, here, use these to build the life you want, the life that's true to who you are.
And while his ideas can be challenging, even unsettling at times, they ultimately point us toward greater self-awareness, personal growth, and a more fulfilling life.
I feel like we've covered so much ground already, but there's still so much more to explore in Twilight of the Idols. It's definitely a book I'm going to want to revisit.
That's the beauty of it. There's always more to discover, more to unpack, more to ponder.
Well, you've definitely given me a lot to think about. And speaking of things that make you think, I know Nietzsche was also very critical of religion, especially Christianity. That's a topic I'm eager to dive into.
It's a big one and definitely sparked a lot of controversy even back in Nietzsche's time. But before we go there, let's take a moment to let everything we've talked about so far really sink in.
Good idea. Let these ideas percolate a bit. We'll be right back to continue our deep dive into Twilight of the Idols right after this.
All right, we're back and ready to tackle a topic I know can be a bit, shall we say, sensitive. Nietzsche's views on religion. I'm curious how this fits into everything we've been discussing about, challenging conventions and forging your own path. Yeah, it's definitely a key piece of the puzzle. Nietzsche was a fierce critic of religion, particularly Christianity, which he saw as a force that was, in his words, life-denying.
We talked about that a little earlier when we were talking about his concept of anti-nature, right? The idea that Christianity kind of encourages people to suppress their natural instincts and desires. It seems like he's kind of picking up that thread here.
Exactly. He felt like Christianity, with its emphasis on sin and guilt, kept people in a state of fear and obedience, hindering their full potential. He saw it as a form of moral enslavement, which is pretty strong language.
Yeah, definitely not pulling any punches there. So if religion is out, what does Nietzsche propose in its place? It seems like a pretty big void to fill.
This is where his famous concept of the death of God comes into play. But it's important to understand that he wasn't simply talking about the literal demise of a deity.
So it's more of a metaphorical death. Is he saying that people are becoming atheists?
Not necessarily. It's more about the decline of belief in absolute truths. And any kind of divinely ordained moral order, it's like the foundation of meaning that Western civilization was built upon is crumbling.
So it's not just about a specific religion, but about a whole way of thinking, a worldview that's been dominant for centuries. That's a pretty radical shift.
Absolutely. And Nietzsche saw this death of God as both a liberating and terrifying prospect.
I can see that liberating because it frees us from the constraints of dogma and allows us to create our own values, but terrifying because it leaves us adrift. Without any clear sense of right and wrong, where do we even begin to build that new foundation?
That leads us to one of Nietzsche's most challenging and often misunderstood ideas, the reevaluation of all values and the concept of living beyond good and evil.
Okay, those are some seriously weighty phrases. Can you break those down for us in a way that doesn't make my head spin?
I'll try. Essentially, Nietzsche believed that the traditional moral framework, based on the distinction between good and evil, was no longer serving humanity. He felt it was stifling creativity, suppressing individual potential, and keeping people trapped in cycles of guilt and resentment.
So it's like that old system had become outdated, no longer relevant to the complexities of modern life.
Exactly. He called for a radical reassessment of all those ingrained values, a complete overhaul of the moral system, and in its place. He envisioned a new morality based on the affirmation of life itself, on the will to power, on striving for individual excellence.
That's where his idea of the Übermensch comes back into play, right? This individual who creates their own values, their own meaning and lives according to their own internal compass. It's like becoming the author of your own moral code.
Yes, the Übermensch embodies this idea of going beyond good and evil. They're not bound by the conventional rules, but forge a new path, a new way of being that is both powerful and life-affirming.
But wouldn't that be a recipe for chaos? If everyone just creates their own morality, wouldn't society fall apart? It seems like there need to be some shared guidelines for how we treat each other.
That's a common concern. But Nietzsche believed that a true Übermensch wouldn't simply indulge in selfish desires or act without regard for others. Remember, this concept is about reaching a higher state of being, not descending into base impulses.
So it's not about everyone doing whatever they want, consequences be damned.
Not at all. The Übermensch, as Nietzsche envisioned them, would have a strong sense of personal responsibility and a deep respect for the creative potential of others. They would understand that true strength comes from embracing life in all its complexity, not from exploiting or dominating others.
So it's more about self-mastery, about making conscious choices aligned with one's values, while also recognizing the inherent worth and dignity of other individuals. It seems like finding that balance is key.
Precisely. It's a nuanced concept and one that's open to interpretation. But ultimately, Nietzsche believed it was the path to a more authentic and fulfilling way of life.
This is all so intellectually stimulating, but I have to ask, are there any real-world examples of people who embody this Nietzschean ideal? Anyone who actually managed to go beyond good and evil in a positive way?
That's a tough one. Nietzsche himself pointed to figures like Goethe and Napoleon, and even the ancient Greek tragic poets, as examples of individuals who embodied certain aspects of the Übermensch.
So people who challenged conventions, pushed boundaries, and created something truly unique and impactful in the world. People who weren't afraid to stand out from the crowd and forge their own path.
Exactly, but it's important to remember that the concept of the Übermensch is more of an aspirational ideal than a blueprint for how to live. It's not about trying to imitate specific individuals, but about cultivating those qualities within ourselves.
So it's about embracing that challenge of self-discovery, of constantly pushing ourselves to become more than we are, to reach for our highest potential, however we define that.
Exactly. And that journey is something that we can all embark on. Regardless of our background or circumstances, it's about recognizing the spark of greatness within each of us and fanning it into flame.
Wow, I love that image. It's so inspiring and honestly a bit humbling. It makes me think about all the ways I might be holding myself back, all the potential I haven't tapped into yet.
That's the power of Nietzsche's philosophy. It challenges us to think critically, to question everything, and ultimately to take ownership of our lives.
This has been such a fascinating deep dive into Nietzsche's Twilight of the Idols. It's definitely sparked a lot of new thoughts and questions for me, and I'm sure our listeners are feeling the same way.
I hope so. And remember, the journey of self-discovery is an ongoing one. There's always more to learn, more to question, more to uncover.
Well said. And on that note, I think it's time to wrap up this exploration of Nietzsche's thought-provoking and sometimes controversial ideas.
Thank you for joining us on this whirlwind tour. We hope you found it as stimulating and challenging as we have.
Absolutely. And to our listeners, we encourage you to pick up a copy of Twilight of the Idols and dive into these ideas for yourselves. You might be surprised at what you discover.
Remember, the goal isn't to agree with everything Nietzsche says, but to use his ideas to spark your own critical thinking and self-reflection.
Challenge those false idols,
Right.
Embrace your instincts, and who knows, maybe you'll even become a little harder in the process.
Until next time, keep questioning, keep exploring, and keep pushing the boundaries of your own understanding.
We'll see you on our next deep dive.